Your summit coming up in Alaska tomorrow. You've called this a publicity effort. In your view, what is Vladimir Putin really after here? And should Americans be concerned what's not being said at the table?
Well, Americans should be concerned about what happens in Europe, because Europe is our greatest trading partner. It's the greatest investor in the United States. So Europe's very important to us. We often talk about China and so forth, but it's really Europe, all of Europe. And Ukraine is fighting for democracy, for freedom in Europe. It's got the largest army in Europe, and if something happens and Ukraine were to collapse, you'd have widespread instability and economic dislocation all through Europe. So it'd be very bad for the United States economically, and it'd be very bad for us morally. I mean, we've been fighting really and struggling since the end of the Second World War. We say we believe in freedom and democracy. President Nixon in 1971 said, America will always help those who help themselves to fight for freedom and democracy. That was the so-called Nixon doctrine. And we basically have believed and lived that. And people my age, from the Cold War, from Vietnam, people who fought in Korea, we always believed we were doing the right thing. So this is a nation started as 40 million people that is fighting for the very values that we hold dear. All they want is a chance for freedom, a chance to choose their own alignment, to be free from the corruption and the mafia influences of Russia. And so we should be very concerned. Now, as far as Alaska and the summit, I think it'd be great if President Trump can stop this war. Stop it cold. But will that happen? So my experience with Putin goes back to the time I was NATO commander. And even then, we knew that Putin's greatest dream was to restore the boundaries of the Soviet Union. He wants control over Eastern Europe, and especially over Ukraine. He can't face China unless Ukraine becomes, again, part of Russia. And of course, the Russians are always worried about the yellow peril to their east. And they should be, because under the Tsar, Russia took a lot of Chinese territory, including the port of Vladivostok and so forth, and China wants it back. So, you know, Putin's caught in the middle. He wants Ukraine. He's gone after it for 25 years. So do we think that President Trump is going to be nice to him and Putin's going to say, well, you know, I've reconsidered this. I'd rather be friends with you than, I don't think so. Because most American presidents have the conceit that somehow they and their personality and their charm will move events in the world. And it really doesn't work that way. The way it works is nations basically pursue their own interests. And the interest of Russia and Putin and all of his supporters and what they're developed and all of their information and propaganda and leadership at home is, we're taking Ukraine, every bit of it. So Putin's going to do what's in his interest and in Russia's interest as he sees it. So I'm not optimistic about what's going to happen in Alaska tomorrow. I'm hoping it's not going to be a giveaway where we blame the victim of aggression for the aggression, because that's what happened in February. The Ukrainians couldn't believe that Russia was going to attack. They couldn't believe it. We tried to tell them. They said, no, we know the Russians, they're not going to do this. But they did. And so they were the victims. So just like in any case of assault or aggression or whatever, our heart goes out to the victims. And that's in accordance with the United Nations and international law and American values. So I hope we will stand with Ukraine through this period.
If this meeting goes the way the Kremlin hopes, what could it mean for U.S. credibility with our allies and for NATO itself?
Well, I think it would be a very bad thing for U.S. credibility and for the leadership of the United States in NATO if it goes the way Mr. Putin probably wants it to go. What he'd like to do is drive a wedge between the United States and Europe, between the United States and our NATO allies. And he'd like to take away the hope that Europe has that the United States will help defend them. But you know, you're facing a major superpower, a nuclear superpower in Russia. Europe can't do that alone. We never thought it could do that alone, and that's why NATO has existed since 1949. So we need to, instead of doing what Mr. Putin wants, we need to confirm America's strong support for our allies in Europe.
You've warned that Vladimir Putin is determined to piece back together the Soviet Union. What are the red flags the world should be watching out for if that's the case?
Well, I think what you have to see in this is he's not going to give up on this until he has to give up. And by that I mean when he calculates that he's got more to lose by giving up than by continuing, then you could expect some change in his policy. From his perspective, what's he going to get out of Alaska? A lot of propaganda, maybe a split between the United States and Ukraine or the United States allies, maybe a reluctance on the part of some nations to continue to provide support for Ukraine. They might say, well, you know, peace is about to break out, so why should we continue to develop our military? Maybe we can, you know. So he's looking, this is a typical Russian ploy. They call it talk, talk, fight, fight. So we've seen this before. We saw it in the Korean situation, where we started talking with North Korea in the so-called armistice talks in 1951, and it didn't finish for almost 2 years. We saw it in the case of Vietnam, where peace discussions started in 1968, didn't conclude until 1973. Talk, talk, fight, fight. Use the talking, use the diplomacy to weaken the resistance. And so that would be what you have to expect from Putin's plans and desires going into this summit.
Speaking on what you said earlier, you've said Ukraine's fall would be a disaster for NATO and for Europe's stability. How close are we to that tipping point now?
I don't think the Ukrainian military is going to give up. Whether the administration in Kyiv, President Zelensky and so forth, thinks he can cut a deal, the Ukrainian military is not giving up any terrain. They cannot give up terrain. So they'll fight all the way to the end, because they know what would happen if the Russians take over Ukraine. They know that it would be the end of Ukrainian language, culture, civilization, and there'd be millions of people liquidated, killed by the Russians to make sure that they really had control of it. That's the way the Russians operate. So they're going to fight really hard. I don't think we're near the collapse, but they are short of howitzer ammunition, short of small arms, short of personnel, short of long-range missiles. And one of the bad things that could come out of this summit is some kind of an agreement that says, well, let's call off the airstrikes. You think that would be really good for Ukraine, but it isn't, because Ukraine's now got long-range drones, and they're actually really hurting the Russians' petrochemical industry. And that's important militarily, but it's also important because that's Moscow's foreign exchange earnings. So I think on net, Putin would gain the most if the airstrikes are called off. And so Ukraine's not going to want to do that either. They're going to fight.
Can Europe and the U.S. push back without triggering a far bigger war?
Well, I'm not sure that's a good question. You know, what we thought we learned in foreign policy is that if you don't push back, you're creating a situation that invites a bigger war. And so my critique of the Biden administration is that they fumbled the ball. When the Russians first came in, the Ukrainians had effective resistance. Now, some of that
Did it start with the Biden administration?
Yes, the Biden administration fumbled the ball because they didn't give Kyiv the artillery, the F-16s, the ATACMS, the MLRS, and so forth that they needed and could have absorbed quickly. Instead, there was this ritual that went through. Said, well, they'll ask for it, and then we'll consider it, and then probably, well, let's talk about it. And then, is it okay with you and the allies and this and that? And maybe 3 months, 6 months, 8 months down the line. And there was also, I have to say, some arrogance on the part of some members of the U.S. military who would say, well, these Ukrainians, you know, they're not as good as us. I mean, they couldn't possibly know how to use our equipment. And of course, that's been totally wrong. Ukrainians are very, very technically savvy. So if we had given them the equipment they asked for, when they asked for it, in sufficient numbers, they might have pushed the Russians right back out. But we didn't do that.
I asked, did it start with the Biden administration, because there were some conversations that this could have even happened before in the Obama administration. Was there anything from Obama's term that kind of bled into Biden's term that has led to where we are
other
now?
than the fact that the same people were there in Biden, most of the same people, they learned the wrong lessons, in my view, from Obama. So in early 2014, the so-called little green men appeared in Crimea. I'd just come back from China. I turned on CNN. I was in an airport. I looked at it, and CNN saying, "These are little green men. Nobody knows who they are." Whatever. I called Wolf Blitzer. I said, "Wolf, look at the equipment. These are Russian soldiers." What I didn't realize is what was happening behind the scenes is the Ukrainian military had said, "We've got them in our sights." But the U.S. military attaché and the U.S. ambassador were told by the Obama administration, "Oh, don't do this. Don't provoke Putin. You don't want to do that. Give him Crimea." I was in Ukraine. I spoke to the Minister of Defense of Ukraine on or about the 1st of April 2014. And he said to me, he said, "Well, we did what you told us to do." I said, "What did we tell you to do?" He said, "You told us to give up Crimea." And so I knew the Russian general who was there from the Cold War days. I called him and said, "Look, we're coming out. You can have our equipment. Don't hurt our people. You told us to do that." I went back to the American embassy. I said, "We actually told them they couldn't defend their own country?" And the ambassador said, "I guess we did." See, the people in the United States, they don't understand this. This was a policy of appeasement that fed Putin's appetite. The thought was, don't provoke him. Well, sure. I mean, that's exactly the same attitude that the British dealt with Hitler in 1937, 38. Don't provoke him. Be nice. Maybe he'll be normal. He's not normal. Hitler wasn't normal, and Putin wants what he wants. Now, he didn't want a big war, Putin. He wanted it to collapse, and he was subtle, and he's an intelligence guy. He's not a military guy. He has multiple means. He uses diplomacy. He uses bribes. He uses sabotage. He uses blackmail and corruption. So it's not just force. It's just that in the news media, we don't see the other elements of Russian national power. So he's worked on this for a long time. And we made the mistake at the outset in 2014 of not standing up more strongly and opposing it. Okay, now what's the second mistake we made? Second mistake was we thought that we could put sanctions on them. Oh, we're going to sanction you. You're going to lose you might lose your yacht. But this is not effective. Now we've had the Obama administration, the Biden administration, now Trump putting sanctions on. Russia's pretty much figured out how to work through those sanctions. They don't respond to the same incentives that we do. They don't watch
What do they respond
Wall
to?
Street. Yes, they have a stock market, but most of the people in Russia, they don't pay any attention to the stock market. And Putin's been careful to protect St. Petersburg and Moscow and draw all the recruits from elsewhere in Russia to feed his ambitions.
So what would they respond to?
They respond to absolute stopping power militarily. If you stop them on the line and blow them back, they will fall back. That's what has to be done. Now, it has to be accompanied by the right diplomacy and the right politics. So Western nations have to have unity. They have to show determination among their citizenry. Polls have to show that the majority of the people in Germany, France, Britain, America, Italy want to see the Russians pushed back. They want to see Ukraine remain a free and independent country. And then You have to have, above that public opinion, you've got to have the right agreements. The statesmen have to agree. Yes, we're going to do this. We're going to send them Patriots. We're going to send them air defense and so forth, blah, blah, blah. All those agreements have to come. But it starts with democratic publics, little d democratic publics, understanding that freedom isn't free. You know, we always hear this in songs, and you see it in Lee Greenwood and people like this, you know, popular music. And it was real easy when we attacked Iraq. But it's not easy now facing down Mr. Putin. And if we don't do that, we won't have our freedom.
Speaking of the Middle East, on Iran and Israel, you've said both sides are holding back a little bit. Is there a real chance for calm, or is this just a pause before the next strike?
It's the pause before the next round of fighting. I think we did put a dent in the Iranian nuclear program, but it doesn't mean they can't get nuclear weapons from somebody else. Now, we're working really hard right now with Pakistan and trying to keep Pakistan on our side so they don't cooperate with Iran. But they're very nuanced. They're very subtle. They can do a lot of things, and they do have nuclear weapons. So we don't know where Iran's nuclear program is really headed. We know we've got to pause. But it was at a tremendous cost to Israel and the United States. At the end of this fighting, about 25% of the Iranian ballistic missiles were actually getting through. And we, in turn, had used a substantial portion of our arsenal, these million-dollar missiles that we're shooting down their dumb missiles with. And so they have maybe 1,000 missiles left. And we're firing 1 or 2 Patriots or THAADs, sometimes 3, at each incoming missile to make sure we hit it. I don't think it's an even balance right now. So yes, it's a pause. And I hope we're ordering as many of these missiles as we can. But we stopped the fighting before the regime fell in Iran. Now, if the Israelis had continued to strike police stations, they might well have encouraged a popular uprising that would have completely overthrown the Ayatollah's regime. But we stopped it. And in return, what the Iranians did is they said, now let's go get anybody who might have had an idea of overthrowing us. So they've launched a nationwide hunt for people of questionable loyalty. They've started mass executions. And so they're doing everything they can to protect themselves and strengthen themselves domestically in preparation for the next round.
Just based off of some reporting, information that was coming out of Iran after these strikes, it didn't seem as though their nuclear program was that affected, because they said 80% of the uranium was gone that they were keeping underground. Do you believe that's credible?
There have been conflicting reports on the highly enriched uranium. Some people have said, no, it's still locked up and destroyed underground. Some people have said it got away. Some people have said there were other places that we didn't strike. So we don't really know at my level, at the public level, how much is left. We know we set back their program. We know we made it difficult for them to move ahead. Did we get a year? 18 months? 24 months? It depends. It would not surprise me to learn that the reason we stopped is because the Iranian foreign minister went to Moscow and President Putin called President Trump and said, we're going to get involved in this thing if you don't stop, or words to that effect. And so we stopped it like that. The Israelis wanted to keep on going. They wanted to finish off the regime. But
Do you believe that the regime...
we've got another conflict that's frozen.
Do you believe that the regime, that anyone will be able to do anything about that regime? Because now it seems like the people of Iran are behind that regime. They believe their government protected them during these strikes.
No, I don't believe that's the case. I talked to Iranians, 80 to 90% of the people wanted to get rid of that regime. They were waiting for another round of strikes to hit the police stations, to take out the Basij, not only in Tehran, but in various regional capitals. And there might have been regime change. Now, regime change is scary. You don't know who's going to come in next. You might have a civil war. It's a nation of more than 90 million people. It's too big for any country to occupy. It's not like if the government collapsed, the United States could send a few peacekeepers in, or the United Nations even. You couldn't do it. So you'd have chaos, and you'd have the risk of nuclear materials, and you might have Al-Qaeda or some version of Al-Qaeda taking root there. So there were a lot of risks if the regime fell. But I'm one of those people who believe that we would have been better off if the regime had fallen.
Going back to the days the Shah was head of
Well,
state?
I hope it wouldn't be the Shah's people coming in. Although his son is one of the claimants. There are others who want to come in. There's Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, and there are other different groups that could emerge. Iran is still a tribal country. It's still a country with different ethnic groups, different languages, different religions. So it's a very diverse place. And it could break up even. So you would see quite a struggle, just like we're seeing in Syria today. So there's no magic solution when you come to regime change.
So, General, with all these tensions building on multiple fronts, Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East, Israel, what should America's strategy be, and what is one thing we cannot afford to get wrong?
Well, I think the key in this era is, number one, stay with Europe. Europe is our major trading partner. It's a major investor. It's the group of countries in the world that most share Americans' values. We have a strong potential alliance in NATO. I say potential because it hasn't applied itself yet in Europe. It's withheld its power. We should work with our allies and friends in Asia, but we shouldn't expect that they're going to want to go to war with China if something happens on Taiwan. So can we persuade China not to attack? Can we build is the world big enough for China and the United States? I think it is. But I don't think that the United States is secure if a hostile power creates instability in Europe. And so I think it's Europe first, stabilize Europe, push Putin, freeze him or push him back, support our allies economically, militarily in Europe, number one. Then do what we can to convince China to work peaceably in the world and promote development. That's the way I see the world right now. As far as the border is concerned, yeah, I think, we need to put the resources into the border. We don't want a lot of people coming in. Biden finally stopped it. So at the end of his administration, no one was coming in. Now we got military deployed down there. I know what those soldiers do. And I know they're making the best use of the time available. But they should be training for military missions. We've got experts at border control. Resource them.
You've been in that hot seat, facing these decisions that carry enormous stakes. What do today's leaders need to hear that they may not want to do or may not know to do?
I think it's very hard for democratic leaders to rally a country. When we were trying to work the issue in the Balkans in the 1990s, you had to sort of keep it under wraps. You didn't want to advertise and say to the American people, we've got a challenge. You don't say that. You say, the economy's looking good, and then you work quietly behind the scenes. Democracies don't have warlike plans. Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came to America in the 1830s, said that democracies can't match the long-term strategizing of these European monarchs. Today it would be the despots and the dictators like a Putin or a Xi. They can plan decades ahead. We go from election cycle to election cycle. But what happens, as Slobodan Milosevic learned to his sorrow in the case of Bosnia and Kosovo in the late 90s. Once democratic nations get engaged in something, they can't let go because the political leadership is committed to it. And so we have to be wise. We have to deter conflict where we can. We have to take the broadest view of America's interests: economic, diplomatic, moral, legal. We have to use our influence to shape a better world, but use force only as a last resort. But when we put Americans in the field, we've got to put them in for a decisive objective to win.
Do you think our current leadership has America's best interests?
Really hard to say. 6 months in, I don't know if we're ever going to go back to what we had before. President Trump is the strongest president we've had, most powerful president we've had since maybe Abraham Lincoln, maybe ever. And for 40 years or more, we've been moving toward the concept of a stronger executive. You know, the Constitution of the United States says the primary branch of government is the Congress. It's the Congress. The Congress, the people's representatives, then the executive, and then the courts. But given the exigencies of national security in the Cold War and afterwards, we've moved toward greater executive power at the expense of legislative power. And so President Trump has continued this. So the question is, what's his vision, and will it work for the majority of Americans? We've gone through, since the American Civil War, 3 cycles: the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, the Age of Reagan. Starting really in the 1980s, we turned on our government. Reagan said the worst words in the English language, the worst 13 words are, "I'm from the government, and I'm here to help you." He said government's like a baby. You put nutrition in at the top, and you know what comes out at the bottom. And everybody chuckled. But it was an assault on the vision of government that we created as a result of the Depression. So we're in the age of Reagan. But President Trump is, he's altogether different. He is using government to create a certain set of values, to push back on DEI, to put greater attention on internal security as opposed to our alliances. And we'll just have to see how this works out.